He is also author of books on Wittgenstein and Agamben. Has also worked as a translator for some of Agamben's books into English. He is young, but already very productive, evidently. So welcome, David.
Hey guys, thank you for being here, and thank you for having me. Listen, I don't really like doing the paper reading thing as much as you don't like hearing just people reading papers. But this paper, which I wrote just for this event, got a little bit over the top. It has 7 different parts, and I need to go through it in 20 minutes. So I'm going to read. So here we go. When Libero and Nadir kindly invited me to this conference, my first instinct was to offer a talk that will basically cannibalize on my book, The Manhattan Project, which is an imaginary sequel, as Libero said, of Walter Benjamin's Arcades Project. As Benjamin dedicated his work to Paris, capital of the 19th century, my book is an investigation of the capital of the 20th. This experimental scholarship came from a desire to write a philosophy book about a place. Not just a philosophy of place, of the concept of place, but a theory of a particular place. I was trying to commit my thought to where my body was. I was hoping to achieve something that Benjamin once called presence of mind. He actually has an essay called The Path to Success in 13 Theses. The idea was to think locally, to go against the tendency to think globally, which seems like a symptom of the universalist fixation from which most philosophers usually suffer. I still see myself as a purveyor of local philosophy, while living in the same area in downtown Manhattan where I have been for the past 18 years. But these days, it is hard to recognize the city about which I wrote. I'm not sure I even care for the remnants or ghosts of the capital of the 20th century, which most people just ignore, like they do the homeless. Reading Libero and Nadir's powerful book about the hyper-mediated city helped me to recognize the anesthetic effect of present-day New York and its slow transformation in the course of the 21st century into an oversized museum or a display city placed under glass, as Benjamin once quoted someone else is saying about Paris. Which is why I don't really want to say anything else about this subject, but offer you instead a taste of my new project, which will be a very short book about the pre-Abrahamic book of Genesis, or the first 11 chapters of the Hebrew Bible: creation, Eden, Cain, flood, Babel. This whole mythological proto-history up to when Abraham enters the fray. I know it sounds totally unrelated to our conference, but please bear with me. As Giorgio Agamben once said, the key to the modern is hidden in the immemorial and the prehistoric. To understand the contemporary city, let's go back to how it all began. My hypothesis for today is that all our modern urban sensibilities are secularized theological sensibilities. The actual material phantasmagorical city of 2017 is like the famous chess automaton that Walter Benjamin described in the opening lines of his last essay on the concept of history. The mechanical Turk was made up of a puppet dressed in Turkish attire that robotically moved the pieces on the board. But it was secretly operated by a hidden, hunchbacked human dwarf who also happened to be a master chessman. Theology, which saturated Benjamin's thought, may seem small and ugly and hidden. But in reality, it still controls pretty much everything, and it is always winning. Or, as Libero and Nadir quote Marx, the tradition of all the dead generations weigh like a nightmare on the brain of the living. You probably know that Marx thought that the commodity is a very queer thing, that it is suffused with theological niceties. When we fetishize a luxury object we buy in a fancy store, we attach to it spiritual, supernatural, magical powers, as people have been doing to religious relics and icons and idols for thousands of years. Capitalism, Benjamin realized, is the most powerful and most horrible religion ever. If so, then let's start by looking at a text that precedes the book of Genesis. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins with this marvelous description of Uruk, located in present-day Iraq, which is the first historical city. See how its rampant gleam like copper in the sun. Climb the stone staircase, more ancient than the mind can imagine. Approach the temple, sacred to Ishtar, a temple that no king has equaled in size or beauty. Walk on the wall of Uruk. Follow its course around the city. Inspect its mighty foundation. Examine its brickwork, how masterfully it is built. Observe the land it encloses. The palm trees, the gardens, the orchards, the glorious palaces and temples, the shops and marketplaces, the houses, the public squares. Find the cornerstone and under it the copper box that is marked with Gilgamesh's name. Open the lid. Take out the tablet of lapis lazuli. Read how he suffered all and accomplished all. Three things enter the earthly stage in unison about 6,000 years ago: the city, writing, history. The first apparatus used to mediate the city is written language. You can clearly see this in the way the epic glorifies Uruk. The city is the alpha and omega of the whole narrative. But written language, a medium invented in the city, will come back to haunt it. Instead of fetishizing the urban landscape, Genesis is written as an attempt to undermine it. Unlike Gilgamesh, which succumbs to the arrow of the city, the task of Genesis is to obliterate it. This feat is achieved in two stages. The first is the story of the first biblical city, which was founded not long after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Our story begins when Cain murdered his brother Abel. This act transformed Cain into a kind of homo sacer. Anybody is at liberty to kill him with total impunity, as a sort of vendetta for his crime. So God puts a mark on Cain, not to shame or condemn him, as is often assumed, but actually in order to protect him, so whomever found him would not slay him. In this sense, all of us today who manage to survive and live in relative peace can do so because we carry a faint version of the mark of Cain, which shields us, at least for now, from injury and lawlessness. After all, there is no bearer of rights who is not also a bearer of guilt. This is the basic logic behind Cain's decision to build the first city, which he named after his son, Enoch. Even today, every city is in some sense a shelter or sanctuary city, beyond which life can be harmed or killed with relative or total impunity. Genesis is reminding us, though, that every display of a safe civilization is also a manifestation of its belligerent barbarism. Cain's urban legacy is the symbol of both. According to Genesis, the progress of civilization is entirely credited to Cain and sons. Beginning with urbanization, arguably the most decisive invention, continuing with their development of the technical ability of metalwork and the artistic ability to play musical instruments. Nevertheless, the text treats these perceived advancements as obstacles. God does not rejoice in humanity's ability to change and be industrious. Again, these are all achievements of the first murderer. he does not seem enthusiastic about the cultivation of either land or man. Actually, the meaning of Enoch in Hebrew, Hanoch, is education. But Adam and Eve, that's, I guess, something not nice to say in an educational institution, but never mind. Adam and Eve had a third son named Seth. Although Cain murdered Abel, he did not inherit the divine blessing. It is Seth who established the direct line leading to Noah. We are not the sons and daughters of Cain, who just gave us culture and civilization. Seth is the common father of us all. But Seth's genealogy, our genealogy, is a very strange description of a life of inaction, idleness, and even boredom. The achievements of 10 generations are summed up in the procreation of the next. No one is being productive in any other sense. They live a kind of blessed, bare life. These purely creaturely beings have nothing to lose, not even their God. Even the formidable faith that Abraham is considered its father does not seem to have the same hold over our proto-forefathers. By the way, where is God? The earthly kingdom may be under the custody of humanity, but the one in the sky does not really belong to God. In the sole possible allusion in the first chapters of Genesis to his heavenly abode, it is indeed written that God came down to survey Babel. But as you can see, it is also plainly mentioned that the city was located in a valley. From this perspective, his decision to destroy the Tower of Babel is meant to punish the builders as well as the readers who wrongly assuming that he resides high above. The Augustinian rumor that God built an ethereal city there in the sky, in the heaven, is unfounded. Frankly, it verges on fake news. Nah, whatever. Another question. What is the language of Genesis? Though the text was written in biblical Hebrew, it would be a stretch to assume that this is the one language used throughout the earth up to the destruction of Babel. To wonder what language the pre-Abrahamites spoke is like asking which god they worshipped, or inquiring about the brand of air we currently breathe. There is only one. We may therefore assume that a generic form of human life implies a generic form of human language. But the language, like the language of birds or the language of cats or whatever, but the language that is simply labeled human language does little justice to a narrative in which almost all the talking is done by God, often with no human in sight, while almost all human speech addresses God. However, this pure language cannot only be divine language either, because, as you may recall, there's also a whole conversation between a woman and a snake, plus 2 minor cases where a human actually speaks with another fellow human. Therefore, the language in the first 11 chapters of Genesis is neither the language of man nor the language of God, neither Hebrew nor Esperanto, but what Benjamin calls language as such. But once Noah's family disbands to form far-flung nations, and the residents of Babel scatter according to their different languages, the one world explodes to smithereens. The ending of Genesis 11 asks its reader to reckon with the irreparable condition of the generation of dispersion. Moses' laws, Jesus' tidings, and Muhammad's prophecies use different strategies to glue the broken fragments. But there is no going back to the original oneness. Following my belief that we should stop reading the Bible right before Abraham is ordered to leave his native land and father's home is to realize that we are all still a part of this human diaspora, which remains true despite the historical twists and turns that have brought us to where we are today, no matter how we speak and where we live. We're all Babylonian refugees. There is nothing in the pre-Abrahamic Genesis to suggest that life's telos is to reach reconciliation, emancipation, or salvation. No one is ever at home. As the Babel debacle demonstrates, it is not in God's best interest to let people come together. Given the anguished earthly existence in the first chapters of the book, unity is probably not even in humanity's own interests. Nor is it advisable to settle down, as the founders of Babel chose to do. As a rule of thumb, whenever biblical characters securely settle in a place, they get into lots of trouble. For example, remember that both Eden and Enoch are ultimately traps to their dwellers. Also, remember that both Cain and Noah were tillers of soil, a vocation that requires sedentary lifestyle, which in both cases led to horrible tragedies. Cain killed Abel, Noah, he started a vineyard, he got drunk, he got naked, his son Ham saw him naked, and he cursed him and he became a slave to his brothers. Not nice. This suggestive rule will prove itself in numerous other cases beyond Genesis 11, including the Israelite settlement in the land of Canaan. The promised land has never been a stroll in the park. This is why Babel's fate was sealed even before the first brick was laid. From this perspective, the temple in Jerusalem replicates the fallacy of the Tower of Babel. Neither monument is really the center of the world or the gate of the gods. That's just the meaning of Babylon. According to the nomadic ideology of Genesis 1:11, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, where movement is of the essence, neither the attachment to the soil nor the worship of a static building can defy the transitory nature of existence. The ruin of Babel is an object lesson in the primacy of mobility over eternity and temporality over locality. It is the construction and sanctification of a certain time instead of a certain place that best symbolizes this new way of thinking. Let me explain. We know that the ziggurat in Babel, was 7 stories high. At the top floor was a single room that was always locked, besides once a year during the celebration of spring. On that holy day, the king of Babylon and the highest priestess climbed the stairs all the way up. They entered the room together, which was totally empty, besides a single bed. The embodiment of earthly and heavenly powers closed the door behind them and had a sacred intercourse, a hierogamy, a sexual union between divinity and humanity. The Hebrews had first had knowledge of this tower and the naughty rites of spring that took place there because they lived in the Babylonian exile. So what did they do? Instead of treating the 7th floor of the ziggurat as holy, they sanctified the 7th day of every week by stopping all their work. The great Jewish American theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel therefore calls the Sabbath an architecture of time. And I think that this is a great counsel for contemporary disillusioned architects. Why not try to design together a new event in time that can be celebrated rather than another object in space that can be possessed? Recently, I lived in Jerusalem for a month. While I was there, this point became clear to me. Place is so ephemeral and phantasmagorical. Time, on the other hand, is so much more real and even palpable. So why not just stop fetishizing certain places, like Jerusalem, and instead begin to consecrate certain times? Why occupy Wall Street if you can occupy May Day or your friend's birthday? It is not a coincidence that despite Benjamin's deep obsession with Paris, his final essay is dedicated to history, not geography. Jewish thought is so invested in the question of temporality especially in comparison with its disinterested approach to the question of locality, which is why it is so agonizing for me to realize how all of this morphed in the current state of Israel treatment of the Palestinian territories as a higher calling. When I returned from Jerusalem to New York, I had a longish layover in Istanbul on a Friday morning from sunrise to noon. So I took a train from the airport and went for a stroll along this seam between East and West. No, I wasn't there to challenge Benjamin's Turkish chess machine for a rematch. But I did end up, despite myself, in Hagia Sophia, this ancient cathedral turned Ottoman mosque turned modern museum. Given everything that I just said about the futility of places and cities and temples, I felt rather alienated inside this musky edifice for the holy wisdom. But then, as I was walking towards the exit, I noticed a big hanging mirror that was reflecting a golden mosaic just above the threshold that I was just crossing. This famous image used to greet the believers as they entered the church, but without the mirror, it would be completely lost on the tourists as they were exiting towards the gift shop. As you can see, baby Jesus sits on the Virgin's lap, holding a small scroll. On one side, Emperor Constantine offers him a model of Constantinople. On the other side, Emperor Justinian offers him a model of Hagia Sophia. Looking at these two sovereigns holding the mizana beams of the city and the church in which I was presently standing helped me understand something about the relationship between urbanism and monotheism, between architecture and scripture. This mosaic reminds me of a strange belief shared by many medieval Jewish scholars. They claim that God was able to create the world because he already had a plan, which he consulted during the first 6 days of creation, as if it was an architectonic blueprint for a new building. But what was this cosmic plan? The curious answer of these rabbinical authorities is unequivocal. The blueprint was the book of Genesis itself. This text existed before the world existed. God was reading the Torah as it was making the universe. It is the origin of the divine art. It is the written arche of God's techne, hence architecture. Going back to the mosaic, please notice that when the infant Savior is presented with the alluring gift of a shiny city and a pretty sanctuary by the powers that be, he much prefers to continue to play with his little Torah. In his infancy, he already understood the potential power of the sacred scroll that is already at hand. That's it. Thanks.
Questions or comments?
I have 100 comments, but I wait for my discussion.
Yes, maybe to make it a little bit more relatable to what we did beforehand, you know, the Bordian line, what appears is good and what good appears, is exactly what the book of Genesis is undermining. If we want to go against the spectacle, just read the Torah. It says it is an argument against the notion that everything that is good appears and everything that appears is good. Because you can't see God.
But this is very similar to the iconoclastic debate.
Go ahead.
Christianity, right, where representations of any kind of representations of a divinity were anathema because they were not actually the divinity.
Right,
So-
and for me that painting, that mosaic is doing exactly that. Yeah, to say, actually the little scroll that he holds at hand, not even him. That's your money shot. rather than the rather than the nice city and the nice sanctuary that we can easily fetishize, and then the metaphor maybe doesn't.
Did I?
That's a specter of language.
Yes, that in the title, yeah.
But that's in the text too, in a beautiful way, but only if God says things, I suppose. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light,
Right.
and light was good, and that happens 5 times.
Right, and this will be the line that Christianity, via Greek thought, will make a lot of fuss over with John, right? But the point that I believe that we need to go
With
back,
John, what are you referring to?
like the beginning was God. How does it start? John 1:1.
John Revelation starts in the beginning.
In the beginning was the Word, and
And
the
the
Word
Word.
was God,
And the Word
and that's
was
Christ.
Right, right.
good.
So when Christ is holding the Torah,
Yeah,
He
yeah.
is one with the Word.
Yes. The only question, I mean, I don't want to get into this theological. I do believe, yeah, Christianity versus Judaism. No. But it's not even a Jewish thought that I'm trying to talk about right now. I mean, it's not about not make a graven image, etc. The iconoclastic debate. The second is just to say that, in a way, it's not even a Christian notion. It's a Greek notion that puts visuality, vision, aesthesis above perception, above all. Actually, when you read the first chapters of Genesis, there's very little visual cues that you get from the text. You don't know how people look like. They touch each other, they speak, but you rarely see anything. And I believe that, I mean, it's only through Greek eyes, Western eyes, that makes us be so, to put visuality, the spectacle, above all else. Whereof I believe that when you read that text, you realize that it is much inferior, that there is no primacy of vision as we have in the West.
This is a wonderful discussion. We should come back to it in the panel discussion, because this amazing. So
Yeah, please. Thank you, guys.